Great. Well, Stephen, I think I'm going to get started here and just cover a couple housekeeping items and then hand it over to you.
Sounds
But I
good.
want to say hello and welcome for all of you for joining Lessening Loneliness and Boosting Belonging in the Workplace. My name is Taylor Adams, and I'm the Director of Workplace Mental Health at Mental Health America, and I'm very excited to share this webinar with you all today. Before we get started, I just wanted to mention that everyone should be muted and unable to turn on their microphone. We are recording the session today, and that'll be available within 5 business days on MHA's YouTube channel, as well as emailed in a follow-up after the presentation, as well as the slides. We are not offering CEUs for this presentation, but you can receive a certificate of attendance from the link that's emailed with materials. I'll also drop it in the chat as well. Please use the chat box or the Q&A feature to drop in any questions that you have. I think we're going to leave a little bit of time at the end to answer those questions. And again, if you haven't introduced yourself yet, please drop your name and where you're calling in from in the chat, maybe a self-care tip, maybe the industry you work in, whatever you'd like to share with us here. And with that said, I'll introduce our presenter today. So today's presenter is Stephen Van Cohen. Stephen is a trainer, consultant, and author of Connectable, How Leaders Can Move Teams from Isolated to All In. He's also the co-founder of thinklx.com, which creates lasting learning experiences for the organization's #1 asset, its people. For 10 years, Stephen has built and delivered learning experiences that drive professional growth and development for the world's leading companies. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Stephen.
Well, thank you, Taylor. Hello, everybody. I am thrilled to be here to talk about lessening loneliness and boosting belonging, how to move self and others from isolated to all in. Taylor did a really great job going through my intro, the book that she mentioned, Connectable, how leaders can move teams from isolated to all in, hit the Wall Street Journal bestsellers list a few weeks ago, which is great because people are really interested in how to lessen loneliness and boost belonging. And we're going to spend a good 60 minutes unpacking that together today. So our story starts here at the very, very tippy top of the world in a tiny Arctic village called Kuklatuk, which has a population of 1,491 people. And because Kuklatuk is so north, it is cold, it is barren, it is burr. It is a place that lends itself to lots of loneliness and isolation. During the winter times, it's dark for 20 hours a day, and it gets down to -75 degrees Fahrenheit, which is freezing cold. And unfortunately, this village had one of the highest teen suicide rates in the world. That is per capita. That is until Canada's national sport took root, which is, of course, hockey. Nope, Canada's other national sport, lacrosse. So this gentleman, his name is Russ Shepard, and he is a teacher at the Kuklatuk High School, and he wanted to do something to help with all of these teen suicides. And he decided that it would be a really good idea to introduce the sport of lacrosse. It would give the students something to bond over. It would give the community something to support, and it would allow a lot of different people to have something worth fighting for and some purpose that everyone can band together to be a part of. So as you can imagine, getting the necessary gear to this really tiny little town at the very top of the world is not easy. There's no Amazon, there's no FedEx, there's what's called the Arctic Sea Lift. And the Arctic Sea Lift is essentially these boats that fight through glaciers and break through ice in order to get supplies to this part of the world. And this resupply system was able to get all of the gear that was required to the Kuklatuk Grizzlies. And the community, by coming together and getting all the gear and supporting these guys, the Kuklatuk Grizzlies made it to Toronto. They made it to the national championship game with regards to their lacrosse team. And it was amazing. And it's a great story about how this community came together in order to get support for this lacrosse team. And through all of this support and through this purpose and through this really great story, Kuklatuk's teen suicide rate, once the highest in the world per capita, it fell to zero. And what do we learn? Well, we learned through this story that isolation battered this community, purpose lifted the community, loneliness ravaged through this community, and it was belonging that healed. And this gentleman, his name's Adam Kickpack. He's an original player and now the coach of the Kuklatuck Grizzlies. And he said, this sport changed my life. And it changed the lives of many people in Kuklatuck. Belonging and purpose, it turned an isolated town plagued by loneliness into a connected town full of hope. And this story is something that we're all feeling in some form and fashion, because today a lot of workplaces are cold and barren. Not as cold and as barren as the remote part of the world, such as Kuklatuck, but cold and barren nonetheless. And much like the people of Kuklatuck, today's workers are lonelier than ever before, resulting in a disengaged, disloyal, and disenchanted workforce. And the reason we're here together today, the overview and the payoff of our 60 minutes together, is that you'll discover how loneliness is impacting work and some simple yet mighty solutions to lessen loneliness and boost belonging, both for self and for others. So here's how we're going to break down our time together today. First, we're going to start with loneliness and belonging, the causes, the impact, and the significance of all of this. We're then going to get into our strategies. There are 4 strategies that we're going to go through in detail as it relates to lessening loneliness and boosting belonging. And then we're going to get into Q&A. I'll leave 10 to 15 minutes to make sure we have time to answer questions. And each of you get to participate in a competition. The competition is going to be to win the copy of my book, Connectable, How Leaders Can Move Teams from Isolated to All In. So all of the information that we're going to go through is essentially going to be turned into a trivia at the very end of our session. So take notes, pay attention. All of the slides I'm going to be able to provide to Taylor. So you'll have access to those after the event, but the lessons from the slides will be what we use for our competition. So in the book and in the session, here's some numbers to give you some context around what we're going to be talking about and where some of this information comes from. I spent 2 years doing research on workplace loneliness and its impact. I surveyed over 2,000 global workers as it relates to their feelings of loneliness and disconnection at work. I interviewed 50 leaders at some of the most prestigious companies in the world. I built one proven less loneliness framework, which we'll get into as we get through our strategies today. And then I've worked with 100+ organizations, companies like the Home Depot and Liberty Mutual Insurance and Kaiser Permanente, and a bunch of others to help them lessen loneliness and create cultures of inclusion, as I've been doing this work for the past year. And I was really pleased that the great Patrick Lencioni was kind enough to read the book and had this to say. He said, Connectable is fascinating, compelling, and extremely readable, but its greatest quality is that it is so darn important. Every leader and manager needs to read this. So I'm excited that you're here today with me, because we're going to unpack a lot of this data that I've been able to work through over the last couple of years, and it's going to be fun. But we're going to start with a question. The question is, are you ever lonely? And if you are not alone. Let's go through some really eye-opening statistics. We'll start with this one. 72% of global workers feel lonely at least monthly, with 55% saying that they feel lonely on a weekly basis. This means that more than half of the world's working population is going to work not feeling fully connected, feeling like there's some kind of a gap with regards to their levels of loneliness. 50% of CEOs report experiencing loneliness in their role. 61% say that it hinders their performance. And 94% of leaders say that their teams are growing lonelier while working remotely. So these are just a few of the statistics that are going to come, but we can tell with a quick snapshot that lots of people are feeling lonely, from CEOs down to frontline employees. Remote work is creating more loneliness as we look across the way in which we're interacting with each other today. And this is definitely a problem that requires some attention and some solutions, which is what we're going to do today. Now, as we get into our presentation, we're going to use some polling software. So if you could open up a browser on your phone and scan that QR code, or if you can go to pollev.com/sync-lx, pollev.com/sync-lx, you're going to have a series of questions and different things we're going to do together through this polling platform. So scan the QR code or go to polev.com/synclx, and you should see this question. Blank is how much loneliness can shorten a person's life, which is equivalent to either 4 to 6 months or sitting 90% of the day, 1 year or sleeping only 5 hours per night, 5 years, which is the equivalent of drinking 5 alcoholic beverages a day, 10 years, which is the equivalent of exercising only once per month, or 15 years, which is the equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And again, at the very top of the screen, you can see where it says polev.com/synclx. We're going to use this same URL for all of the polling, and I'll give you just a minute to make sure you get in so you can answer this question. So right now, the 2 leaders are 15 years, smoking 15 cigarettes a day, 5 years, which is drinking 5 alcoholic beverages a day. And we see different answers across the board. So thank you for participating. The correct answer, drumroll please, is 15 years or smoking 15 cigarettes a day. 15 years or smoking 15 cigarettes a day. That's pretty bad. If loneliness had a side effect warning label, it would read, quote, loneliness may cause increase of inflammation, disrupted sleep, abnormal immune response, depression, anxiety, higher stress levels, early cognitive decline, alcoholism, cardiovascular disease, stroke, Alzheimer's, diabetes, suicide, and even early death. Yikes. This is pretty serious. And the reason why loneliness has all of these really gnarly side effects is because when you're feeling lonely, your brain is going through a fight or flight response. And when you're in a fight or flight response, you are releasing stress hormones. And those stress hormones allow for all of these really bad physical and emotional and mental impacts to take shape. So this is something that we definitely need to address because it is wreaking havoc on our workforce. And we're going to start here with a definition of loneliness, because before we could figure out what to do about it, we first need to understand what it is. The definition is as such. Loneliness isn't the absence of people. Loneliness is the absence of connection. Loneliness isn't the absence of people. Loneliness is the absence of connection. And connection comes in all kinds of different shapes and formats. Connection to self, our coworkers, a leader, a purpose, a spouse, a planet, a community, friends, family. We have all of these connection points. And when our perceived inadequacy of the connections we want differ from the connections we have, we feel lonely. So loneliness isn't something that everyone feels in the exact same way. It's also not something that is remedied for every person in the exact same way. Extroverts and introverts both feel lonely at different points in time, but the way they experience loneliness and the causes are going to be individualistic. So that's a really important distinction that we have to understand. Someone who is surrounded by people may still feel lonely because we need more than the mere presence of people in order to feel fully connected. If you've ever been in a coffee shop surrounded by others, or you're at a networking event and there's lots and lots of people, you can still feel debilitatingly lonely because loneliness is being seen through, belonging is being seen as. Until someone really sees you and is able to connect with you in that moment, you can feel really lonely. And unfortunately, too many of us are being seen through because of some causes that are at play, especially at work. So here are some of the biggest derailers for why loneliness is taking shape. The first is due to busyness. We deprioritize relationships and instead focus on getting everything done. We put more emphasis on the tasks and the to-dos than the people around us. There was a psychologist who determined that the average human has 150 undone tasks registered in their brain at any given time. We're busier than ever, and it's creating less margin for us to connect. The second, no surprise, technology and social media. We're trading connection for convenience. The convenience of IMs and text messages and emails are really great ways to have efficiency and frictionless communication, but it limits the amount of actual connection that we have with one another. So technology and social media. The third is what's called dependency shift. And I'll give a little bit of context to this one. 20 years ago, if I wanted to take someone out on a date, I would call a friend to figure out what restaurant to go to. If something broke in my house, I would call a neighbor in order to figure out how to fix it. If I needed advice, I'd maybe call a parent. Nowadays, if I need to figure out where to take a date, I go to Yelp. If I need to fix something, I go to YouTube. And if I need advice, I go to Google. The amount of dependency that we have on one another as a species has been obliterated because of this. All of the world's answers are now curated into our laptops and iPads and cell phones. So we just aren't helping each other as much. And it's created a big void, a big disconnect, because we're just not needing each other as much as we once did. The fourth is what's called immediacy. So we're opting for swift transactional relationships versus more meaningful ones. Remote work, no surprise, right? We're just not in the same place at the same time. We're not having genuine connection points because of the way in which we're working through our devices. And always on work culture. So because of this always on work culture, little time is left to really pursue and nurture our connections. An overly professional state of being at work. So when professionally masked and work safe versions of ourselves are what we display, it's really hard for people to see you. They see the amazing avatar you've created, but that avatar creates a disconnect because they're not connecting with you. They're connecting with the persona that you're pretending to be at work. And then last but not least, a lack of purpose. So a lack of an understanding for how a person's work impacts the greater community. And we're going to talk about purpose as we get into some of the strategies. So these are some of the modern causes. There are more, but these are the ones we really need to be aware of as we start to unpack why 72% of global workers feel regularly lonely. So here's my next poll question. Go back to pollev.com/synclx. You'll see this question on your screen. What do you believe contributes most to your or others' loneliness? Is it busyness, technology and social media, dependency shift, immediacy, remote work, overly professional, or a lack of purpose? So what do you think? So technology and social media has come flying out the gate. 40% of people feel like technology and social media is the main culprit for this, but you can see everyone's being represented. So depending on where you are and what you do, we could understand that all of these things are contributing. But from the data we collected from the more than 2,000 global workers, technology and social media has come out on top as being the number one reason why people experience loneliness. And the reason is, and it's really interesting, because the part of our brain that registers communication is a different part of our brain that registers connection. So we're communicating all day long and we have access to each other like we've never had access before in history. And yet the technology is leaving so many of us feeling disconnected because through our chats and our posts and our social media shares and our DMs, it's giving us a head fake of sorts, a connection head fake where we think we're being connected, but the part of the brain that's actually registering connection isn't going off because it's communication and not connection. And we'll talk about more of this in detail as we get into our slides. So why is this also important? Well, let's go back in time and let's talk about the evolution of our species, because it's going to give us some really good context for how we solve this problem and how we further understand it. So why are humans the most dominant species on the planet? Is it because we're the strongest? No, we can't outmuscle a gorilla or fight hand to hand with a grizzly bear. It's not strength. Is it because we have protective armor? Absolutely not. Nope. Our skin is pretty fragile. It's because we're the fastest. No, we can't outrun a cheetah or outswim a shark. The reason we are the most dominant species on the planet is because of social collaboration. It's our ability to work with one another that has allowed us to climb to the very top of the food chain. And the science of all of this has proven just that. So humans, we're social creatures, and we have a deep desire to be accepted, cared for, and involved in meaningful community. And these desires were, and they continue to be, essential for our survival. So if we go back many, many, many millennials, and we look at our great, 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 great grandparents, We knew that when we were removed from a tribe, when we didn't have other people to pool and share resources with, when we didn't have others to fight the saber-toothed tigers and the woolly mammoths, right? We couldn't take down a woolly mammoth in order to get food and create a nice, warm pair of fuzzy slippers. We couldn't do that by ourselves. We needed to depend on others. And that dependency on others was so important for our survival that we created this evolutionary requirement that is causing us to stay connected. And loneliness back then was lethal. Today, it's not lethal, but it still triggers a stress state, which leads to inflammation in the body, which can damage blood vessels, tissues, and ultimately impact our performance at work. So the science of this was proven by these two MIT researchers. And they did this really cool experiment where they put people through this experience of isolation. And they had a brain map where they were registering the brain activity for these people who were going through this experience. And the part of the brain that lit up when someone felt excluded was the exact same part of the brain that lit up that registers physical pain. So let me say this again. The part of the brain that lights up when you feel excluded or isolated or lonely is the part of the brain that lights up when you are feeling physical pain, which is crazy to think about. But over the course of our evolution, we knew that our survival was so dependent on others that when we were feeling lonely or excluded or isolated, that's the part of the brain that was going off. So when you're feeling lonely, your brain is essentially saying, hey, this is a high threat situation. You're in danger. And at work, if people are showing up feeling lonely and their brain is in a high stress, high fight or flight environment, then it's impossible for people to do deep work. People are distracted at best and debilitated at worst. So when we understand why our brains respond to loneliness in the way that it does and why it has such harmful impacts to us physically, emotionally, and mentally, then we can start to be a bit more proactive with some solutions. We say in the book that addressing loneliness is not a soft topic, it's a dire one, because people are unable to show up as their fullest, most amazing versions of themselves if they're feeling this way. But there is some good news. The good news means that if you do experience loneliness, then it simply means your brain works. That's good news. And loneliness, it isn't shameful. It's a signal. It's a signal that we belong together. Loneliness is essentially the same as hunger. Whereas hunger tells us you need to go eat an apple or forge some sustenance. When we feel lonely, it's just our brain's way of saying you need to forge a connection. You need to go find your tribe. It's a really useful emotion that once we understand how to lessen it becomes a really amazing thing because it's nature's cue that we're better connected. So when we're not feeling this way at work, here are some of the really, really important numbers to be aware of. So lonely workers are 7 times more likely to be disengaged. They're 5 times more likely to miss work due to stress or illness, twice as often to think about quitting their job, and they're more inclined to believe their work is lower quality. And this may not be a surprise, but it's good to reinforce that lonely workers are also more likely to be remote workers. So in essence, this means that non-lonely workers are more engaged, more dependable, more loyal, more confident, and more productive. All really important reasons why addressing this at work makes sense. And why work is a place where we recommend addressing this is because work is the most fertile ground for these connections to take shape. After sleep, work is the activity where we spend the most of our waking hours engaged with, and it's littered with lots of loneliness lifelines, as you'll learn as we get into this presentation. People are less lonely when they have one work friend, just one work friend who they feel connected to, understood by, and can share their ups and downs with. Purpose is a supreme loneliness suppressant, and work gives us an opportunity for that. And work also gives us lots of opportunity for learning and development. And learning starves loneliness. When your brain is enraptured in learning something new, it doesn't have the capacity to feel lonely or excluded or sad or angry or frustrated. So we have lots of opportunities to learn at work. And there's lots and lots and lots of touch points for why work is such a fertile place for loneliness to be lessened. So let's talk about how we can do that at work. So we talked about loneliness and belonging, the causes, the impact, and significance. Now let's dive into some of the strategies. We're going to introduce what's called the Less Lonely Framework. And the framework looks like this. It's a circle. And there are 4 continuous parts. And the first part is to look at loneliness, meaning that we need to identify loneliness in ourselves and others. The second is to invest in connection, which means we need to improve the strength of work relationships. The third is to narrow the focus, which means we need to illuminate what's most important at work. And then the last is to kindle the momentum, which means we need to inflame what's working to sustain progress. And we're going to go through each one of these relatively quickly. In the book, we have an entire chapter dedicated to each one, but we'll give you one strategy for each of these 4 components. This framework can be used by anyone, and it's in a circle because you don't do these one time and you're done. This is a continuation. These are the things we have to constantly be mindful of if we want to starve off loneliness. So let's start here. Looking at loneliness. And there are 3 steps to looking at loneliness. The first is to look at loneliness. This means that you need to be able to get some awareness and understand the impact and what it is. Now, the fact that you're all here with me today means you can check that off of the to-do list, because you're essentially learning a lot about loneliness and what to do about it. And then the second 2 components, you need to look inward. So understand how lonely you are. And then you need to look outward, meaning that you are able to pay attention to the people around you. And is loneliness normal as we start to look at loneliness in ourselves and others? Well, we need to ask this question: are you human? If the answer is no, then no. Loneliness is definitely not normal. I don't think robots experience very much loneliness. But if yes, you are human, then loneliness is very normal. So before I get into the signs of what to look for when it comes to loneliness, how often do you think your coworkers feel a sense of loneliness? This is a good place to start, just to give this a bit more brevity or a bit more context around how important this all is. So how often do you think your coworkers feel lonely? Hourly, daily, weekly, monthly, yearly? Never. So essentially 80% so far say that their coworkers are experiencing loneliness on a daily or a weekly basis, almost 90% now. And nobody believes that it's yearly or never, which gives us some important context, right? That the majority of you are saying, yes, I think that I have coworkers who are feeling this sense of loneliness, which is important for us to start to understand what to pay attention to. So here's this next question, and this one's a little bit different. But what are the indicators that someone is experiencing loneliness at work? So this is a qualitative question, so you can put in anything you want. And then as the responses come in, you can upvote or downvote the different items. So we'll get an idea of what you think is the most prevalent indicators as it relates to someone experiencing loneliness. So disengagement has come out on top. The majority of you are upvoting disengaged, okay? Decreased productivity, withdrawn, good. A lack of communication, separation from the team, anger, missing work. Okay, they stop communicating. So this is, you're off to a good start. I'm going to give you some very specific things to pay attention to. But as far as with disengagement, a lack of communication, decreased productivity, they're withdrawn, they stop communicating. Yes, these are definitely some of the signs. There are 4 signs, though, that I'm going to encourage all of us to pay extra attention to as it relates to spotting loneliness. The first is what's called lack of learning and development. Essentially, this means that people are not pushing themselves to be better. They're not trying new things. They're not learning and growing. They're staying very complacent. The second is excessive work. Oftentimes, when people feel lonely, they use work as a distraction from their personal life. They overwork because they don't want to deal with whatever's going on in their personal life. And while we don't necessarily want to demotivate someone who's working really hard, we do need to pay attention to the fact that maybe work is acting as a crutch. And if someone's always excessively working, that's not good for their long-term sustainability and their burnout levels and their mental health. So excessive work is a sign. The third is what's called a change in routine. So abnormal behaviors that catch your eye. A lot of the items that you put down in that last poll question have to do with this one. So they're just acting a little bit off. They're not really, doing the things they normally do. Usually they're early for work. Now they're coming in late. Usually they do a really good job with their assignments. Now their work is taking a hit. So any change in the routine can be a cue. And then little input, which is a signal that there's discomfort within the team or the organization. So what tends to happen is when someone feels lonely, instead of reaching out to others, we retreat inward. And the more lonely we feel, the more we retreat. So signs of disengagement, signs of lack of interest, signs of only talking about work, all of those are signs that someone might be withdrawn. And that withdrawn feeling is usually an indication that someone might be feeling lonely. So who's most at risk? Well, the research has proven that the loneliest workers are single, childless, well-educated, non-religious, non-heterosexual, and remote workers. The loneliest professions are legal practice, engineering, and science. So no surprise, but jobs that have lots of social interaction tend to have less lonely employees. And there's no impact on loneliness dependent on the geographic location, the job tenure, the gender, race, ethnicity, or salary. So what does this tell us? It tells us that some workers are more at risk than others. However, as a reminder, all of us experience loneliness and are susceptible to being lonely at work. The above are simply the most susceptible based on the research that's been done. And here's a visual to help encapsulate all of this. From the C-suite down to the entry level, who's lonely? Everyone. It's lonely at the top, it's lonely in the middle, it's lonely at the bottom. We're all experiencing this in some form or fashion. So to close out this section of looking at loneliness, I'm going to give you one of my favorite quotes by the photographer Ansel Adams. Ansel Adams says this: "Photos are often looked at, seldom looked into." Photos are often looked at, seldom looked into. So what we need to do, we need to start seeing the people around us. And the more we can look into the people, the more likely we are going to spot signs of loneliness. And in the book, there are 10 signs. And when we get to the end of our presentation, there's a free resource that I'll be able to provide to you that give you the 10 signs and a check sheet that you can use in order to determine how lonely some of your team members might be. So stay tuned for that. But that's what looking at loneliness is all about. The second is to invest in connection. And it's important to note, connections do not build themselves. They take intentional and continual effort. So we've identified loneliness among our team members. Now we need to invest in connection. And let's talk about one way that you can do that successfully. But first, one more quick question. How long does it take for loneliness to lessen during a two-person interaction? So two people are communicating. How long does it take for a restorative interaction to take place? 3 minutes, 5 minutes, 1 minute, 5 to 10 minutes. Okay. The word minutes is getting big because obviously most of you are using the word minutes in your inputs. Less than 5 minutes, 30 minutes, 10 minutes. Okay, well, from this quick word cloud, I get this sense that the majority of you have determined that it takes minutes, right? And I see 60 minutes. And from some of these inputs, it takes a lot of minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 30 minutes. That's an extended amount of time in order to feel connected. But there's really good news. Research proves that it takes 40 seconds. It only takes 40 seconds to have what's called a restorative exchange with one another. 40 seconds. Now, this research was done by a guy named Nick Epley and a woman named Juliana Schroeder. Nick Epley, he's a behavioral scientist out of the University of Chicago. And every day, Nick would ride the train from the suburbs of Chicago into the city. And he was always so surprised at how quiet these train cars were. There are hundreds of people with amazing stories and jokes and wisdom, and yet nobody is communicating with each other. So because he's a behavioral scientist, he wanted to figure out why. So he conducted this experiment. He put different train passengers into these three conditions. Condition one, the solitude condition. They were told, keep to yourself, you can't talk to anyone. Condition two was the control condition, do what you normally do. And what do you think people did? They kept to themselves. And number three, the connection condition. People were told you have to speak to somebody sitting next to you. Now, for any of my introverts who are listening right now, you might be having a mini panic attack thinking about talking to strangers on a train, but the research was really, really interesting. So here's what Nick discovered. People reported the most positive experience in the connection condition. They had the most enjoyable ride, they were the happiest, and they were the most joyful when they were connecting with somebody around them. But before they were put into this connection condition, people were asked, which of these three do you think you're going to be happiest in? And people thought that keeping to themselves or being in the solitude condition is what would allow them to be the happiest. That wasn't the case. Connecting with others, even strangers, it made them feel good. And it didn't matter if you were the initiator or the receiver. So Nick found this to be quite interesting. So he replicated this experiment across city buses and cabs and at airports and at waiting rooms, and each had the exact same result. People were happiest when they were connecting with others. And it did not matter if you were an introvert or an extrovert. So here's a quick depiction of the evolution of ignoring others on public transit. In the past, we used newspapers. Today, we use iPads and cell phones and noise canceling headphones. We've been avoiding each other for a very long time. And our brains mislead us into thinking that our exchanges with others are going to be unfavorable. And yet the data is very clear. You feel better and you feel more connected when you take time to chat with somebody else around you. So Nick, him and Juliana, they went to the city of Chicago and they said, we got this great research. We think you need to introduce a car where people can communicate more openly. And the CTA said, no, we did our own research. And people said they want a quiet car. Again, people thought that they would be happier not talking to people. So then Nick said, well, have you ever had a chatty car, a place where people can like openly have conversations and get to know one another? And the CTA said, yes, we used to have what are called bar cars, but we had to get rid of them because, are you ready for this? They were too busy. They were too popular. People were having so much fun on these connection cars that they had to get rid of them, which is sad because most people, they wrongly predict that engaging with others is going to be unpleasant. And yet the research is clear that when we take time to connect, even with a stranger, even for 40 seconds, it makes us feel restored. So here's a strategy that we can deduce from all of this. The strategy is to become more interruptible. Be more interruptible. Being interruptible comes in two forms. The first is to send interruptibility signs to the people around you. Give them a cue you're up for a chat. If you're on an airplane, don't walk in with noise canceling headphones. Maybe keep them in your bag until you sit down next to somebody and you strike up a conversation. If you're standing in line at the grocery store, don't stare at your cell phone, look up and smile at somebody around you. The more interruptible you make yourself, the more likely there will be an exchange, a restorative exchange with somebody around you. And when it comes to work, be mindful of how interruptible you are. We're so task focused that oftentimes we inadvertently remove the people who need us the most at work. I have a 4-year-old. My 4-year-old, she loves dance parties. So typically at 2:00 every couple of weeks, she pops in my office and says, Dad, throw on some Taylor Swift. I want to have a dance party. And that's a moment where I can say, sorry, honey, I really have to get this done. Or that's a moment where I could validate that she is the most important person in the world, and we can have that dance party. And what I've learned is that being interruptible might make you less productive, but it will make you more remembered. So be more interruptible. So the second to the last strategy is called narrowing the focus. Illuminate what's most important at work. This means providing full focus on the activities that foster fuller relationships and narrowing your attention to the present and on others. There's a whole long chapter of all of these narrowing activities that we can use work for. Again, unfortunately, we don't have enough time to go through all of them. So there's just one that we'll talk about today. And we're going to start with this question. What's the most valuable resource on the planet? Well, I think we all could agree that oil is a pretty valuable resource. So Chevron has a $210 billion market cap. It's pretty big. ExxonMobil has a $258 billion market cap, which means combined, the two largest oil and gas companies have almost 500 billion in market cap. Very valuable resource. However, the graph next has a 897 billion market cap. And I think it's actually over $1 trillion today. And what is the commodity that this company is in the process of mining? The company's Facebook or Meta. And essentially what they mine, their resource is attention. And attention is the new oil in today's economy. And when is loneliness lessened? When attention is received. So how do we make the world less lonely? We wield our attention well, undivided and fully. And you can see from my fully validated, very scientific graph, most of us spend most of our attention on TikTok or looking at the delivery status for our DoorDash meals. And on the very, very far right side, the amount of time that we're actually giving our undivided full attention to others is pretty minimal. So the way that we could improve this is when we are having opportunities to interact. If we want to wield our attention fully, we need to listen to unlock. Too often when we listen to either win an argument or to fix the perceived problem. Instead, we need to listen to unlock. We need to listen to understand the person, to really show them that we're curious and that we care about what they have to say. When we listen to unlock, it gives that person validation that they're desirable, that you're really wanting them in your presence. And when we listen to unlock, it sends a very clear message that you care. Robin Williams has one of the most beautiful and heart-wrenching quotes of all times. He says, "I used to think the worst thing in life was to die all alone. It's not. The worst thing in life is to be surrounded by people who make you feel all alone." When you have an opportunity to be in someone else's presence, listening to unlock and giving your undivided attention is a gift and will allow that person to feel seen and less lonely. So the next time when a colleague comes to you with an issue, preface the conversation by saying, "Do you want me to share, fix, or understand?" So that's the third strategy. And we're going to get into the last strategy to make sure we have enough time for some Q&A. And the last strategy is to kindle the momentum, inflame what's working to sustain progress. This is how we awaken more meaning at work. We need to continuously stoke that workplace purpose. And the way that we can do that is by focusing on others. Gratitude and service towards others can lessen loneliness. So we need to proactively look for ways to help others and or express gratitude. And it doesn't take much effort to move from lonely to connected, one text or email to someone expressing your appreciation for their work. When we were doing our research, we interviewed a guy named Dr. Stephen Cole. He's a genomics researcher out of the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA. And he said, "Stephen, the single greatest way to pull somebody from feeling isolated and lonely and disconnected back to feeling connected is to essentially reach out your hand and say, I need you. I need you to help me with this. I have this problem and only you can solve it." Because when you can make somebody feel significant and needed and desirable and valued, that is the quickest way to pull them back into the thread of humanity. So we have the opportunity to do this at work when we focus on others. And when we remember that relationships don't have to be lasting to be meaningful, we can do this throughout our entire day to make somebody feel cared for and special and seen. The other way we can do this is by remembering this technique. The technique is a thread that goes through these 4 scenarios. So the scenario number 1 is scholarship fundraisers felt more motivated to secure donations when they had contact with scholarship recipients. Lifeguards were more vigilant after reading stories about people whose lives have been saved by lifeguards. Cooks were more motivated and worked harder when they saw those who would be eating their food. And radiologists were more accurate reading x-rays when shown a picture of the patient. So what's the theme? The theme is when workers are connected to the people benefiting from their labor, they perform better and loneliness is lessened. So if we identify the beneficiaries of our labor and we can understand the impact that we're making, that's a really good strategy to allow for loneliness to be lessened. So that's the last strategy. Those are the 4 that I said we would get through. Now we're going to turn to our competition. Competition takes 2 minutes, and then afterwards we'll get into our Q&A. We're going to use the same polling software that we've been using throughout the entire day together. pollev.com/synclx or scan that QR code. Answer correctly as fast as you can. Okay, so the faster, the better. And then the winner is going to receive a copy of my book. You can see at the very top where your guest ID is. That's going to be important should you win this competition. So get your devices ready. There's 4 questions. I talked about all of these things as we've gone through this session together today. We're going to get things queued up. And the trivia is going to begin now. Here's question number 1. Loneliness is the absence of blank: people, connection, or purpose. 3 seconds, 2, 1. Okay. Connection, 90% of you, congratulations. That is great news. So here's our leaderboard. We got a lot of leaders right now, but that's gonna dwindle as we get into these next questions. Here's question number 2, which is not a modern cause of loneliness? Dependency shift, undemanding work, technology and social media, immediacy. Second. Okay. Okay, undemanding work. Congratulations. 74% of you got this one correct. Let's see the leaderboard. Yep, still got a lot of people tied for first. Here's the next question. What percentage of global workers feel lonely at least monthly? 70, 71, or 72%? Okay, let's see. Good. 56% of you got that correct. 72% was the right answer. Okay. Guest 621 has a perfect score, but it's still anyone's game. We have one more question to go. Here we are. Which is not part of the Less Loneliness framework? Look at loneliness, invest in connection, network with others, kindle the momentum. This is for all the marbles. All right, let's see. Network with others. So 51% of you got that correct. So the winner of our competition, guest 621, congratulations to you. If you are the winner, I need you to take a screenshot of your first place leaderboard. I need you to email that screenshot to me at steven@lesslonely.com, and I will send you a copy of my book, Connectable. So let's turn it over to Q&A. I think there's some Q&As that we have queued up, but I'm also going to collect questions here using the same polling software we've been using the entire time. You'll be able to upvote and downvote the questions. So it gives us a nice way to make sure that everyone has input on what questions we should answer with the next 10 minutes that we have. So while those questions are being accumulated and voted on, a quick recap. The recap is as follows. As a reminder, loneliness isn't shameful, it's a signal. Loneliness has a direct impact on engagement, retention, and performance. Loneliness is a birthmark. It's not a black eye, it's something we all have and we all experience, and we are better together. Nothing of significance has ever been created alone. Loneliness is a biological cue that we need each other. And the strategies that we talked about are looking into yourself and your team, being interruptible, listening to unlock, and identifying the beneficiaries of your labor. And if you found this webinar helpful, and if you want what's called the connection kit consists of a self-assessment It consists of these 4 videos that you can watch that talk about the solutions and the main problems for loneliness at work. And then there's what's called the 10 signs of a lonely workforce check sheet. You can scan that QR code, or you can go to connectionvault.com. Connectionvault.com, scan the QR code. It's all free. You'll be able to get access to these great materials, and hopefully you find them helpful. If you enjoyed this conversation, feel free to follow me at Ryan and Steven across all platforms. I even made TikTok videos. So if you're interested to see what the heck I'm doing on TikTok, you can follow at Ryan and Steven. And with that, we will get into some of our questions. So, what are some ways to be perceived as interruptible? That's a really good question. I was on a flight last week, and I was on the aisle side, and there was a guy sitting by the window. He had his noise canceling headphones in. The guy in the middle had his headphones, but they were in his hand. And when I sat down, as soon as my butt hit the seat, he said, "Hey, I'm Brian. Nice to meet you." That was the only indication I needed that Brian was interested in having a chat, and me and him spent an hour and a half on the airplane, really having a wonderful time connecting with each other. So the guy sitting by the window, the fact that his noise canceling headphones were in made it very clear that he was not interruptible. Brian, however, with his headphones in his hands, he basically gave this cue of, okay, like, I have headphones. If you don't want to talk, that's fine. But he gave me a nod. He essentially gave me an invitation to be able to acknowledge a conversation or not. So being interruptible is allowing for those types of opportunities to take shape. An open door policy is not in itself an indication of being interruptible, because how you respond to somebody who comes into your door is what's going to allow them to feel like you want them there or not. And then, being mindful of how you're interacting with your devices when you're in public. It's really common for us when we're by ourselves to just look at our phones, especially when we're standing in lines. But that's a really good way when we're in line to be able to just look up and smile at somebody around you. Making eye contact and giving a nod is typically all that's required in order for two people to share an exchange and have a restorative connection. So that would be some techniques on how to be a bit more interruptible. I understand that we need to connect with others, but what about when work is a dramatic and clicky environment that makes a person feel uncomfortable? Well, the fact that this is the most upvoted question means that this is something obviously many of you are dealing with. And unfortunately, I do not have a one strategy to do that's going to fix this. If you have a systemic cultural problem, it is going to take a lot of effort in order to create the right conditions for connections to take place. So one of the things you can do is you can start to, there's 2 recommendations that will help. These will be like jumping off points that you can start to try out. The first is to create an environment of psychological safety. And psychological safety essentially just means that everyone on the team communicates and has input about as much as everybody else. And that everybody on the team, when they communicate, they feel heard. So when those 2 conditions are in play, everyone's communicating about as much as everyone else, and people feel heard, it starts to create this sensation of psychological safety. And by getting everyone to start to participate more, then the influential people who might be making the team or the organization feel clicky, their voice is lessened a bit and other people's voices are raised, and you can start to see a bit of a shift in how that group dynamics is at play. So that would be one thing that you can do. The second is to get past professional, because what tends to happen at work when there is a clicky environment or when people just don't trust one another, it's usually because they don't know one another. You don't trust people you don't know. So finding ways to get to know the person and not the professional can be really helpful. So one of my clients is Kohl's. Kohl's is the large retailer that I'm sure all of you have probably bought clothes from in the past. And in order to help create more of an inclusive environment, they introduced an activity called show and tell. And show and tell is exactly like you think it is. Every single Monday morning, when they have their team kickoff meetings, one person's designated to do a show and tell. And they essentially show one item from their home that is meaningful to them. And they tell the story for why this thing is so meaningful. And what it does is it creates an opportunity to see the person. And it allows people to see one another in a bit more personal manner. And in one of the sessions during the show and tell, the team member showed his hiking boots and said how he loves to hike and he's been all over the world as a mountain climber and as a hiker. And somebody else in the team who has worked with this guy for a lot of years didn't know that. He's also a hiker. So what do you think they did? They went on a hike together. And it created a whole nother level of relationship and connection, because now there's an uncommon commonality that we were able to uncover and understand. So when there's a clickiness, when people aren't getting along, when there's not a psychologically safe environment, we have to be really mindful and intentional to create some understanding, because that will help close some of those gaps. So that would be a couple of high-level recommendations. What about when you are always the one putting out gratitude and positivity to others, but feel forgotten by everyone else? The good news is the more grateful you are, it releases serotonin in your brain. So at least you are, allowing yourself to feel happier by doing those activities. When it comes to reciprocation, unfortunately, you can't force others to be as positive or as chipper or as happy or as thoughtful as you are. Now, there is this concept called reciprocity. And reciprocity means that, like, if I invite you to a party, you feel obligated to invite me to a party. So by continuing to be grateful and positive, you essentially are creating little mini waves, and you're giving people cues that they should be doing this back to you. And that's about all you can do, because you can't control everybody else. You can only control yourself. So I would say continue to do what's best, and hopefully you have a breakthrough with some of these activities. The other thing you can try as relates to like gratitude and positive recognition is to have exercises that everyone can participate in that are easy to execute. So maybe you suggest, if you're not a boss or a manager, a quick team building exercise where you simply have people on a team write a letter for somebody else. And that way each person is forced to write one letter to somebody on their team acknowledging why they appreciate them. Or you can have an activity where a leader pairs people up to go out to lunch with one another, and then the company foots the bill. That way different people from different areas can have a unique experience sharing a meal together. So finding ways to get everybody to do something as like a team building exercise or an icebreaker, maybe that will help. So those are some things that maybe you can consider. And let's see if there's any other Q&A. I think we have time for one more. Obviously, loneliness has drastically increased with the pandemic, but do you think our society was already headed in the direction? Yeah, so before the pandemic, in 2018, 61% of Americans cited themselves as being regularly lonely. So in 2018, 61%. In 2017, it was 7% less. So it was, lower. 2018, it got higher. 2019 and 2020, when the pandemic started to hit, our research jumped that number up to 72%. So if you're looking at the bell curve, it's definitely been like this. So loneliness has been happening well before the pandemic. The pandemic just put a spotlight on it. So that's my last question and answer. Taylor, I'll turn it back over to you.
Sorry, I hate to cut it short. My face just appearing here. But there were a lot of questions and it was really hard to keep up. So that's exciting. Lots of folks really appreciate having this information shared. I just want to say thank you to everyone who joined us today for sharing your questions, for interacting with the different polls that Stephen shared. And a big thank you to Stephen for sharing your perspective and different resources with us. So thank you all and have a great rest of the day.